Picture this. Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and Vance, the heavyweights of American diplomacy, are left cooling their heels in an Islamabad waiting room, only to receive a flat rejection from Iran. "We will not meet with you." Tehran's directive was unequivocal. They would broadcast their stipulations strictly through Pakistani intermediaries. By the conclusion of this geopolitical breakdown, I will illustrate precisely why this standoff is not merely an embarrassment for Washington. It is a carefully engineered snare, architected entirely by Beijing. This unfolding crisis impacts you immediately. Whether you live in the United States or the United Kingdom, the cost of your fuel, the interest rates on your home, and the foundational stability of your financial ecosystem are inextricably bound to the events transpiring in that Pakistani waiting room today. You must recognize that this has transcended conventional foreign policy. This is the definitive battle over who will author the rules of the global economy for the next 50 years. Before reaching that ultimate verdict, we must dissect three pivotal details that mainstream analysts are uniformly ignoring. Without comprehending these foundational pillars, my forthcoming argument may seem implausible. However, once understood, the impending outcome becomes completely inevitable. I have scrutinized these international paradigms for years. I previously forecasted that the maritime blockade would suffer severe vulnerabilities, and I maintained that the Iranian government would not simply disintegrate. Now, I will reveal why the actual landscape is radically disconnected from the narrative propagated by major Western media networks. Consider the first critical oversight. Iran's Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, recently touched down in Islamabad as part of an expansive three-nation expedition. A state teetering on the precipice of absolute economic ruin does not dispatch its premier diplomat on a regional tour. Crumbling regimes broadcast desperate calls for salvation. Tehran, conversely, is projecting a starkly different image. Iran is transmitting a deliberate signal that it retains formidable alternatives. Allow that reality to sink in. While operating under a suffocating American naval embargo, with dozens of commercial ships forcefully rerouted and severe Treasury Department penalties freshly enacted, Iran is boldly executing a multinational diplomatic offensive. The strategic calculus simply fails if your underlying assumption is that Tehran is currently facing defeat. That represents the first fragment of the puzzle, yet the second element renders this situation highly volatile. The entity that facilitated this diplomatic excursion is neither Pakistan nor Iran. The essential question you must pose is this: who extracts the maximum benefit from American delegates sitting powerless in an Islamabad lobby while Tehran dictates the exact parameters of engagement? Let us examine what the United States publicly claims to demand. Washington insists that Iran must relinquish its enriched uranium reserves, instantly unblock the Strait of Hormuz, entirely dismantle its sophisticated ballistic missile initiatives, and concede to a newly forged security framework for the Middle East. That represents the official, public-facing posture. But what does America actually require at this exact moment? Washington desperately needs a diplomatic accord it can package and promote as a decisive triumph before the domestic political fallout of this standoff becomes completely intolerable. Internal military dissent is mounting. Active duty personnel are increasingly investigating paths of conscientious objection. Recently, Donald Trump disclosed to the press that Iran was formulating an offer, yet he frankly acknowledged he remained ignorant of the specific terms. A commander-in-chief who is completely unaware of his adversary's proposing conditions is not negotiating from a posture of dominance. He is negotiating against a relentless political clock. To grasp the magnitude of this dynamic, we must consult history. The last occasion a major power occupying Pakistan's exact geographic and political position was leveraged as a diplomatic conduit during a superpower clash occurred in 1971. Henry Kissinger utilized Islamabad as a highly secretive backchannel to establish diplomatic ties with the communist regime in China. Pakistan brokered that monumental summit, yet the nation that harvested the ultimate reward from the ensuing geopolitical earthquake was neither Pakistan nor America. It was China. Today, Islamabad is deploying that identical strategic formula. They are proactively facilitating a diplomatic exchange, and they comprehend the ultimate beneficiary of this maneuver far more astutely than Washington does. Nevertheless, it is imperative to understand that Iran is not negotiating from a sanctuary of comfort. Tehran lacks a flawless escape route in these discussions. Every prospective avenue demands excruciatingly painful compromises. The crucial Strait of Hormuz remains bottlenecked, and that strategic blockade is presently bleeding the global economy by an estimated $1 billion daily due to skyrocketing freight costs and astronomical maritime insurance premiums. Domestically, the Iranian currency has collapsed, hemorrhaging over 40% of its aggregate value since December. Widespread civilian uprisings, initially ignited by an unbearable cost of living, have been crushed with lethal state force. Recently, The regime executed a citizen accused of colluding with Israeli intelligence amidst the January riots. A government that deploys capital punishment against demonstrators merely to enforce civic obedience is undeniably an administration buckling under severe internal friction that it cannot entirely suppress. However, a cornered adversary historically remains the most lethal participant in any geopolitical theater. Iran implicitly recognizes that it cannot endure a protracted, direct military clash. Yet, the administration also understands that the specific parameters of any impending treaty will permanently dictate its survival for the succeeding generation. Consequently, Tehran is leveraging the absolute final asset it controls, manipulating the literal architecture of the negotiation process itself. Herein lies the fundamental structural dilemma. The United States, Iran, and Pakistan all desperately demand a resolution that this specific environment cannot concurrently deliver to all three actors. America demands an expedited, face-saving pact. Iran demands a remarkably resilient, survival-ensuring framework. Pakistan demands a diplomatic victory that amplifies its regional authority without concurrently triggering massive alarm bells in neighboring India. That unavoidable collision of strategic interests is what we are genuinely dissecting today. Let us solidify structural fact number 1. The Strait of Hormuz facilitates the transit of 20% of the globe's daily petroleum supply through a restrictive choke point, measuring a mere 21 miles at its narrowest juncture. The United States Navy successfully diverted 31 commercial vessels during the inaugural week of the embargo. Nevertheless, evaluating current Iranian export volumes of roughly 1.5 million barrels daily, that maritime interception sequesters, at the absolute maximum, 40% of the aggregate flow. The remaining 60% persistently circulates unhindered via sophisticated shadow fleet logistics, clandestine ship-to-ship transfers, and untraceable intermediaries. The American blockade is fundamentally failing to operate at the tactical magnitude requisite to mandate Tehran's unconditional surrender. It is exclusively functioning at the magnitude necessary to sustain domestic political theater. This transitions us to structural fact number 2. In 2018, when the initial surge of maximum pressure sanctions crippled the Iranian economy, China assimilated approximately 22% of Iranian petroleum exports via direct acquisitions. Today, that precise metric has surged to exceed 80%. In 2018, the ratio was 1 in every 5 barrels. Today, it stands at 4 out of every 5. This does not represent a fleeting market fluctuation. This is an irreversible structural transformation. China has devoted the past 7 years to silently and systematically engineering the requisite alternative infrastructure. They have established autonomous financial networks, alternative maritime insurance apparatuses, and colossal dark fleet capabilities engineered explicitly to render the American economic embargo entirely survivable for Iran. This is not mere conjecture. It stands as one of the most exhaustively verified realities in contemporary energy economics, yet virtually no Western analyst is anchoring this truth within their assessment of the current dialogues. Furthermore, we must acknowledge structural fact number 3. The diplomatic exchanges presently unfolding in Islamabad do not constitute the genuine negotiations. The authentic negotiations have already been transpiring in Moscow. Iran's own state media recently corroborated that multiple phases of indirect deliberations have occurred in venues far removed from Pakistan, most notably featuring Russia. Moscow remains a state whose entire national revenue relies profoundly upon inflated global petroleum valuations. It is also a nation whose strategic, boundless alliance with Beijing currently runs deeper and more cohesive than at any epoch since the 1950s. The diplomatic facade currently being constructed for the international press in Islamabad is merely a superficial spectacle. The authentic architecture underpinning it was conceptualized in Beijing and officially endorsed in Moscow. This is precisely how China orchestrates global destinies without ever physically stepping into the negotiating chambers. They achieve this not through deploying combat troops, but by monopolizing the foundational infrastructure. Finally, structural fact number 4. The primary stipulations currently dominating the table, which encompass Iran's heavily enriched uranium inventory, its ballistic missile capacities, exhaustive sanctions alleviation, the release of confiscated capital, and demands for war indemnities cannot possibly achieve total resolution within Islamabad. The Turkish foreign minister recently proposed that Iran's intricate nuclear portfolio might reach a conclusion during the subsequent phase of dialogues. However, there will inevitably be a subsequent phase and another phase following that. Every single negotiating rotation that expires without a conclusive settlement is another rotation wherein the alternative economic architecture constructed by China becomes more profoundly entrenched, more universally normalized, and exponentially more arduous for the United States to dismantle. The authentic inquiry is not whether a diplomatic consensus will ultimately be secured. The pivotal inquiry is what the structural composition of the world will resemble by the moment that treaty is finally formalized. Now that you comprehend the three critical variables that most analysts entirely neglect, let us revisit the conclusion I initially presented. China flawlessly engineered this geopolitical snare. Let me chart exactly how this narrative concludes. I predict this crisis resolves through one of two distinct trajectories. And the ultimate trajectory hinges entirely upon one pivotal variable. Will America concede to a diplomatic arrangement on Iran's favored timeline? Or will Iran's precarious internal stability shatter before that timeline officially expires? Let me be exceptionally precise regarding scenario 1. A meticulously choreographed, managed agreement materializes from Islamabad within the ensuing 60 days. Iran formally caps its enriched uranium reserves marginally below the weapons-grade boundary and pledges to a systematically phased unblocking of the Strait of Hormuz. In reciprocation, the United States terminates the naval embargo, releases a designated fraction of Iranian sovereign capital, and the American administration forcefully proclaims a historic triumph. This specific trajectory technically remains viable, but it necessitates Iran's internal civic cohesion remaining intact long enough for its diplomatic corps to execute the agreement. Moreover, it requires Washington to swallow terms that fundamentally lack the absolute eradication of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, which is the exact concession the American administration publicly mandated. This represents a remarkably narrow corridor. It demands that both adversarial factions publicly declare absolute victory over a diluted outcome that genuinely provides neither faction with their original objectives. Historical precedent consistently reveals that such delicate compromises almost never materialize once immense domestic political friction is already accelerating on both sides of the divide. This introduces scenario 2. The dialogues in Pakistan yield a generalized framework, but fail to produce a finalized treaty. The Islamabad summit adjourns with a nebulous joint communique. Both contingents publicly categorize the summit as progress. The United States naval embargo persists, albeit at a drastically diminished operational severity. Iran maintains the Strait of Hormuz in a partially restricted state. Concurrently, the covert shadow petroleum economy continues to function flawlessly. With every elapsing week, an increasing volume of the Global South's essential energy commerce transitions toward Chinese-administered financial architecture rather than conventional, dollar-denominated banking channels. Within Iran's borders, the severe authoritarian crackdowns persist. The civilian uprisings inevitably reignite. The regime ultimately endures not due to inherent strength, but because the domestic resistance lacks a foreign benefactor willing to hazard a direct, kinetic confrontation with the Revolutionary Guard. Concurrently, Washington, inevitably consumed by its approaching domestic election cycle, merely declares the Middle Eastern emergency to be managed. This is precisely how China methodically dismantles the global hegemony of the United States dollar. They do not accomplish this through direct military warfare. They accomplish it through unyielding, calculated endurance. Grounded in this evaluation, here are my three definitive forecasts for the future. Prediction 1. The ultimate treaty that eventually surfaces from these drawn-out deliberations will absolutely not mandate Iran to fully relinquish its enriched uranium. Conversely, it will incorporate an intricate monitoring apparatus that permits Tehran to maintain its inventory marginally below a publicly broadcasted limit while clandestinely preserving the technical infrastructure necessary to resurrect a comprehensive weapons program within 12 months if deemed necessary. Washington will assertively market this as denuclearization. Tehran will fiercely market it as sovereignty. Technically speaking, both narratives will contain truth. Prediction 2. Within the ensuing 12 to 24 months, Pakistan will officially broadcast a revolutionary bilateral energy commerce pact with Iran. Crucially, this pact will be transacted in a non-dollar currency, most probably leveraging a yuan-rupee hybrid financial settlement mechanism. This colossal transition will be introduced to the international community as a mere technical necessity, compelled entirely by suffocating American sanctions. In truth, it will signify the initial formal, structural fracture in dollar-monopolized energy commerce initiated by a sovereign state that concurrently hosts American military installations. Prediction 3. The lasting historical legacy of the Islamabad dialogues will not be a durable Middle Eastern peace accord. Instead, it will function as the official inauguration of a parallel global diplomatic architecture. We are observing the genesis of an era wherein China, Russia, Pakistan, and Turkey proactively function as the authentic guarantors of regional security treaties. Consequently, the United States will be demoted to functioning merely as a veto authority, a superpower that retains the military capacity to obstruct initiatives but no longer retains the diplomatic credibility necessary to construct them. America will undoubtedly preserve its unrivaled military dominance. However, it will fundamentally forfeit its convening power. And convening power, the singular capacity to dictate the terms and command the room, is the exclusive variant of geopolitical leverage that genuinely compounds over time. Once you perceive this transition, you cannot unsee it. You might be posing, question 1. Is Iran not excessively weakened right now to be issuing demands to the United States? Is the economic embargo not achieving its purpose? The categorical answer is no, and here is precisely why. Severe economic coercion and strategic bargaining leverage are absolutely not synonymous concepts. Iran is undeniably impaired economically, yet it is not strategically quarantined. A state fortified by Chinese financial infrastructure, shielded by Russian diplomatic vetoes, and expedited by Pakistani mediation is not a nation stripped of options. The American embargo is undoubtedly maximizing Iran's financial agony, but it is comprehensively failing to eliminate Iran's strategic alternatives. This leads us to question 2. But is Pakistan not a steadfast U.S. ally? Does that not ensure that America dictates this mediation framework? I am supremely confident that Pakistan's strategic calculus in this dynamic is not fueled by blind allegiance. It is fueled entirely by prospective positioning. Indeed, Pakistan accepts roughly $1 billion annually in United States military and financial aid. However, Islamabad also shares a colossal physical boundary with Iran, relies acutely upon Gulf energy imports, and has attentively monitored Beijing inject over $60 billion into its domestic infrastructure via the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Pakistan is meticulously threading a geopolitical needle right now, and the destination it is threading that needle toward is unequivocally not Washington. Finally, question 3. What should you practically do with this analytical intelligence? What does this colossal paradigm shift mean for your everyday existence? I am certain that the single most vital takeaway is recognizing that this is intrinsically a currency narrative, not merely a military narrative. If the United States dollar's paramount function in global energy valuation deteriorates even marginally, the foundational cost of imported commodities in the United States and the United Kingdom will escalate structurally. That translates directly into relentless, entrenched inflation that central banks simply cannot rectify by artificially tweaking interest rates. The functional implication for you is unambiguous. Do not erroneously presume that a prospective ceasefire declaration signifies this global emergency is genuinely resolved. The tectonic structural realignment transpiring beneath the surface will persistently accelerate long after the mainstream media headlines pivot to the subsequent distraction. In the year 480 BC, the Persian Empire, spearheaded by Xerxes, launched the most massive military armada in ancient antiquity to subjugate Greece. He forcefully traversed the Hellespont with 200,000 soldiers. He successfully incinerated the city of Athens to ash. He sincerely believed that his insurmountable, brute strength had already secured victory in the war. Yet, the singular crucial theater he failed to command was the sea. At the legendary Battle of Salamis, the severely outnumbered Athenian armada, commanded by Themistocles, lured and subsequently annihilated the colossal Persian fleet within a constrained strait, where Persian numerical dominance abruptly transformed into a fatal liability rather than a strategic advantage. Xerxes observed the absolute decimation of his fleet from a golden throne situated safely upon the shoreline. He withdrew in utter defeat within days, and the Persian Empire never successfully menaced the Greek mainland ever again. Within this contemporary geopolitical arena, the United States is functioning as Xerxes. The Arabian Sea acts as the modern Hellespont, and the constricted, prohibitive corridor where overwhelming military statistics cease to matter and diplomatic architecture seizes absolute command is the waiting room in Islamabad. America did not forfeit this strategic clash upon a physical battlefield. It lost inside a diplomatic chamber it was not even permitted to enter. The competing superpower that meticulously designed and constructed that chamber did not possess the need to fire a single military projectile. China fundamentally grasps that it does not need to triumph in kinetic warfare. It solely needs to own the chambers where those wars eventually conclude. That concludes the comprehensive analysis for today. Bear in mind, this is not a prophecy. This is the rigorous execution of game theory and structural history. This evaluation might ultimately be proven incorrect, but if I am incorrect, we will reconvene in this exact forum and logically dissect precisely why, because that is exactly what authentic geopolitical analysis demands.